Despite the media's hyperfixation on President Biden, convicted felon Donald Trump suffered 3 high-profile back-to-back-to-back humiliations, with 2 of the country's most influential newspapers publicly declaring that Trump is unfit for office and challenging him to withdraw. And perhaps more importantly, a wildly popular Republican governor boldly declaring that he will not vote for Trump in the upcoming election. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have a couple of clips to look at in this video. I actually want to start with this one because, again, I think this one might be the more devastating news for Trump. I want you to consider the current political climate, the current state of the Republican Party, and how it's regressed into an authoritarian cult of personality, and consider that this guy, Spencer Cox, the Republican governor of Utah, who is currently running for re-election this year, is publicly declaring that he will not vote for his party's cult leader.
I've said before, I haven't voted for the top of the ticket since 2012. I've certainly had my concerns. One of those is what happened on January 6th. I'm hopeful. I want my party to win. They chose a candidate this time around that was not my first choice. Wasn't my choice last time either. But the party's spoken, and that's who they have chosen. And so I've said I'm not going to vote for either presidential candidate this year. I'll write somebody in as I've done in the past, but I am supportive. I do want Donald Trump to succeed. I want my party to win. We desperately need the right people in the right positions. I'm very anxious for who he picks as vice president. That's going to make a big difference.
Governor Cox, we can tell you're anxious. You are very anxious, right? The stammering, the stuttering, the rambling. This man is clearly uncomfortable about what he has to say, but he is boldly declaring it. I mean, guys, think about this. Think about the courage it takes to be an incumbent Republican governor in a red state, which is what Cox is, running for re-election this year, the same year, and publicly declaring on the Clinton News Network that you are not going to vote for the cult leader at the top, a malignantly narcissistic sociopath who doesn't tolerate dissent very well. It's a bold stance by Governor Cox. Again, he tries to dress it up. I want my party to succeed. And, I hope Donald Trump picks a good VP. But he also declared that he didn't vote for him in 2020 or 2016. That is devastating. I want you to contrast that, again, despite the stammering, the bold action, the bold declaration of Governor Cox, and contrast that to another Republican governor, a guy by the name of Chris Sununu of New Hampshire. We played this clip months ago. This is from an ABC interview with George Stephanopoulos. And as a reminder, Sununu despises Trump, has publicly criticized Trump, campaigned for Nikki Haley. And yet after all of that, this is what Chris Sununu did.
That's how badly America wants a culture change.
So just to sum up, you would support him for president even if he's convicted in classified documents. You support him for president even though you believe he contributed to an insurrection. You support him for president even though you believe he's lying about the last election. You'd support him for president even if he's convicted in the Manhattan case. I just want to say the answer to that is yes, correct?
Yeah, me and 51% of America.
Governor, thanks for your time this morning.
That's what happens when you put political expedience above principle, when you put person above party, above country. That's the exact opposite of the way it should be, okay? Contrast that with the debate, the ongoing debate, the high-profile debate among Democrats about potentially jettisoning President Biden, right? You have 10 sitting Democrats declaring that they think that President Biden should drop out after a 90-minute debate. Right? That there's a stark contrast between the two parties. It's also part of the reason why Republicans, despite a terrible win-loss record under Donald Trump, why they are so often able to punch above their weight classes, because they unite. There is no limiting principle to this party. Democrats, we're able to and we're willing to fight amongst ourselves even at the most inopportune times, which in many ways is a huge flaw because the Democratic Party, generally speaking, is just much more concerned with principle and good faith compared to the Republicans. So again, kudos to Spencer Cox for declaring what he did. I'll also remind you, Cox, again, is very popular. 81% approved of him in the Republican primary, even though he was challenged by a far-right Trump supporter. There have been op-eds written for years about Governor Cox's popularity. His approval rating at the last time I saw it polled was at 64%. Pretty good, very popular governor. And he's favored, I believe, to win the gubernatorial race against his Democratic challenger, which makes sense. Again, Utah being a red state and Cox being an incumbent. Again, a bold gamble, though, folks, a bold gamble for him to nervously publicly declare that he's not going to vote for Trump. One can only imagine how Trump's going to react to this. Now, I want to talk about the other things too, which is that two of the biggest and most influential newspapers in the country, the New York Times and the LA Times, have now publicly declared that Trump is unfit for office and they believe he should withdraw. Now, the reason I think this is important isn't just the high profile nature of these newspapers, but the fact that so many op-eds and editorials have been written about President Biden withdrawing. And the comments from many, including myself, is, okay, well, if that's the case, if there are newspapers out there who are purportedly nonpartisan, right? The LA Times, the New York Times, if you ask them, they'd say they're nonpartisan, right? They call balls and strikes. Well, if you're going to call for President Biden to withdraw because, again, of a 90-minute debate performance, again, fair enough if you think that it was disastrous, if you have questions about his cognitive fitness, but shouldn't you also be asking those same damn questions about Donald Trump, given the infinitely greater litany of examples of cognitive questionability? Well, we're finally starting to see the results of the pressure campaign, the backlash by people like me and probably people like you who have demanded the asymmetry of the expectations go away, that the media holds both candidates to the same damn standards, because now, back to back, the LA Times and the New York Times are publicly calling for Donald Trump to withdraw from the race because they think he's unfit for office. I want to play this clip too. This is a member of the New York Times editorial team talking to Morning Joe earlier today about this op-ed.
And Maura, I'm curious, did the Times board feel the necessity to do this, especially after saying a couple of times that Joe Biden shouldn't run for president?
Funny thing is, this has been in the works for far longer than many readers may think. This has been in the works for months, since long before the debate performance that was heard around the world. And of course, this is consistent with not only the behavior we've seen from the former president, but from what this board has said about Donald Trump for years. And we, in fact, have repeated that in recent weeks. And so, it's clear that the point we want to make here is this is not about policy. This election is not a policy disagreement. This is about two vastly different visions for America, one that is committed to multiracial democracy and to pluralism, to human rights, to well-being and reproductive freedom, and things that most Americans say consistently that they want and are committed to. And the other vision for America, which is about retribution and about authoritarianism, and is hateful, racist, and extremely closed-minded. We don't believe that that's the direction that most Americans want to go in. And so we are really urging American voters to listen to Donald Trump's words and to take him seriously, and to understand that this second presidency could be even more dangerous than the last.
So listen, she says that this editorial, which, by the way, is much more elaborate than the one that they made for President Biden when they asked him to withdraw several days ago, right? It's even got this motion graphics and stuff behind it. It's called Donald Trump is Unfit to Lead. I don't know if that's true. Perhaps she's telling the truth. But what I do know is, again, I think it's important to hold people to the same standard, particularly when the standard is President of the United States. Both candidates have been president and both candidates are trying to be president again. There's no reason to justify or there's no reason for an asymmetry, let alone an asymmetry to be justified. And so, like so many other people, I was frustrated that the New York Times, which claims to be a nonpartisan paper, right now, I've gotten actually in public debates with people, including Professor Ben Burgess, a guy I respect. He's saying this is ridiculous. You can't impose that expectation on the New York Times. Trump nor his supporters are going to listen to it. It doesn't matter. I understand that the perception is that the New York Times is a liberal rag, right? A liberal newspaper, but they're actually quite hard on President Biden. We've talked about it in video after video after video. In and of itself, it is a story. There's purportedly a feud between the White House and members of the New York Times staff, including potentially their editor-in-chief, because the perception is, Biden hasn't given them an interview, which is like the first time in decades where a president has not been interviewed by the New York Times. That's purportedly created some hard feelings. And so they hyperfixate on the president's faults, potential shortcomings. They are very unusually critical of a president this successful. And so if that's the case, if they're nonpartisan, if they're going to criticize Democrats, if they're going to call balls and strikes, fair enough. But then you should hold these two men to the same standard, the two parties to the same standard. And if Joe Biden is unfit to be president, if that's your opinion, that's fine. But there is no metric by which Joe Biden is unfit to be president that Donald Trump is. So again, I don't know if this was in the works. They say it was, but this was long overdue. And so they have written this very detailed op-ed from the entire editorial board of the New York Times talking about why Donald Trump is unfit for office. And you can click on the various subheadings. They have hyperlinks to evidence for their claims. So they cite their sources and they go into reasons. They say that Donald Trump lacks the moral fitness to be president. He lacks the principled leadership to be president. He lacks the character to be president. How the president's rhetoric matters and Trump's rhetoric is terrible. And of course, Donald Trump's disdain for rule of law. So folks, this is definitely worth a read. And again, I can't help but feel that it's also the result of a pressure campaign by people like me saying, no, it is irrational. It is illogical. It is ridiculous to try to hold President Biden to a higher standard than Donald Trump. Both men need to be held to the same standard, and that's how you evaluate them. The LA Times, again, one of the biggest newspapers in America, they also, the same day, released an op-ed saying that their editorial team, one candidate is patently unfit for the White House. It's not Biden, by the Times editorial board. Democrats are in a crisis at the moment, divided over whether President Biden should stay in the race after his disastrous debate last month or clear the way for another younger candidate. Biden's shaky performance raised concerns about whether he can win in November and prompted calls from prominent Democrats, columnists, and others for him to step aside. It's up to the Democratic Party to sort this out. But it's time to refocus attention on the only candidate in the race who is patently unfit for office, any office, and an immediate threat to democracy, Donald Trump. It's unbelievable that the nation is spending so much time on the question of Biden's verbal acuity when the greatest concern ought to be that his challenger is a self-aggrandizing felon and twice impeached election denier. Trump fomented the January 6th insurrection, shows contempt for rule of law, and shamelessly lies in pursuit of more power. He's an authoritarian who admires murderous despots, wants to jail his political enemies, and has publicly flirted with declaring himself dictator on his first day back in office. And it goes on like this. So, folks, as you know, I have been very frustrated with the asymmetry in the media. I have no problem with the media criticizing President Biden. President Biden is not perfect, not as a president, certainly not as a candidate. Democrats are not perfect. There are good faith criticisms to levy. What I do not abide and what you should not abide is an asymmetry in the standards. It is irrational, it is dishonest, and it is stupid, and it's all of these things, to hold Democrats to a higher standard than Republicans, to grade Republicans on a curve. The only way you can ever have an accurate assessment of anything is to hold peers to the same standard. These are the two major political parties. These are the two leaders of those two political parties and the two leading presidential candidates. You have to hold them to the same standard. Otherwise, you're either a liar or a moron. So I'm glad to see that Trump is suffering these back-to-back-to-back humiliations, and consider that this is in a context where the media is right now devoting 99% of its energy, not just right-wing media, but mainstream media, on parsing every stuttered syllable of President Biden and completely glossing over Donald Trump. The fact that he suffered these three high-profile back-to-back humiliations is something worth noting. Let me know what you think in the comments.